Okay, so we just finished talking about demand. Now we're going to talk about supply. This is page 15 in your resource guide. Supply, remember, is the second very, very important concept in microeconomics. Just to remind you, we're talking microeconomics. The definition of supply is the quantity supplied of any good, that is the amount that sellers of the good are willing and able to produce. So if we continue in this analogy of the blue jeans, it's the amount of blue jeans that the manufacturer is willing to produce. We talked about the law of supply or the law of demand being if the price is lower, we demand more. The law of supply is exactly the opposite. The higher the price, the greater the supply. Which makes sense, right? If the price that American Eagle can get for their jeans is higher, they're going to want to sell more. That's a positive relationship. The law of demand was a negative relationship. This is going to be important coming up after a bit. The next thing I want to talk about, we talked about the demand curve and how it was downward sloping. The supply curve is upward sloping. It's the opposite. I'm going to drop down to the next page here. Similar to the fact that we had a demand schedule, this is a supply schedule. How much gas a person is willing to supply at each individual price. And then those inputs become the supply curve. Note, the supply curve is upward sloping, right? So the demand curve was downward sloping. Supply curve is upward sloping. That's a very, very important concept. If I keep scrolling down here, similar to that demand schedule, here's one that's a market demand schedule. So they just took all of the individuals in the market and they listed out their quantity of willing to supply at each price. And then they just added those together. So here you have two upward sloping supply curves for two individuals. Add them together and you get the market supply curve. All right, now we're going to jump back up to page 15 now that we've talked about those curves. We talked about things that shift the demand curve, being things like the amount of money that you have, your expectations in the market, your taste, all of those things cause shifts in the demand curve. It then follows that certain things cause shifts in the supply curve. Important factors that might cause the supply curve to shift. There are 4 of these. The first one is input prices. Inputs are the things that go into a good or a service. So in the example of jeans, the inputs would be the cotton that denim is made of. The inputs would be the metal that the little buttons are made of and that the little rivets are made of. Other inputs would be thread. Another input would be sewers, seamstresses, or seamsters to create the jeans. That labor is an input. If those things are higher, the amount of supply is lower, but if those input prices decrease, the amount of supply can increase. Technology is another thing that has a big impact on supply. When technology innovations happen, usually the process of creating a good becomes less expensive. It kind of goes back to input costs, but technology is seen as its own influence here. Just like we had expectations impacting the demand curve, expectations impact the supply curve. Let's go back to that back to school sale. If American Eagle knows that many families are going to be buying jeans in August and not buying jeans in the heat of July, then their supply of jeans for August will be higher. Their supply of jeans for July will be lower. Maybe that changes with shorts. Their supply of shorts in July is higher. Their supply of shorts in August may be lower. And again, just like the number of buyers influence demand, the number of sellers is an influence on supply. When you have more sellers, the quantity of supply increases. and often causes the price to go down. That brings us to another important concept, which is equilibrium. This is kind of a challenging concept here to define, but it's very easy to understand. When I was talking about the supply and the demand moving all the time, it's kind of a seesaw, right? There's a point at which those two things even out. The price that a person buying is willing to pay matches equally with the price that a supplier is willing to sell for. That is equilibrium. So basically it's when everything matches up and gets us to a point where everything is balanced and the market is stable. So in economics, a market is in equilibrium when no participant in the market, that's a buyer or a seller, has any reason to alter his or her behavior. When we don't feel the need to alter our behavior in economics, that is equilibrium. Here's another way of saying this. The market equilibrium occurs at the combination of price and quantity where the supply and demand curves intersect. So, remember how we talked about the supply curve being downward sloping? The supply curve, is upward sloping. And the demand curve is downward sloping. Let's see if it'll let me draw on here. Nope, it won't. So here we have the demand curve. It slopes down. The lower a price is, the more we're willing to buy. Here we have the supply curve. It slopes up. The higher a price is, the more a seller is willing to supply. This dot right here, that's where they meet. That's called the point of equilibrium. Now, in your resource guide, starting on page 20, it goes into a lot more information about equilibrium, competitive market equilibrium. This is a concept that I'm not going to do a video on. We didn't get to it in the other class either. I just really, really wanted you guys to get supply and demand. If you're really interested in this and loving economics, continue reading by all means. There's a lot of really fabulous information about markets and models in your resource guide.